Dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to welcome you once more to this IPA webinar. As you might know, this is part of a long-term project organized by the website's editorial committee. It's a virtual space devoted to the discussion of central topics of psychoanalytical theory and clinical topics, as well as the interdisciplinary contributions. Our aim is to foster the diffusion of psychoanalytical thought and open this space of worldwide dialogue among IPA members. Today we'll discuss a central subject of our clinical practice, the principle of confidentiality. As we are all well aware, the protection of patient confidentiality is not only a technical resource to support the clinical process. It reflects our ethical commitment to safeguarding the privacy, which is recognized as a human right. We have with us 4 panelists. They are all members of the IPA Confidentiality Committee. They will share with us all the knowledge and experience in this important but also very complex topic. When I say complexity, I'm referring to the fact that in psychoanalysis, confidentiality brings into play different levels of analysis which might be overlapping and interconnected. What's more, as you all will hear along this webinar, it needs to be considered within a wider context of social, legal, cultural factors. This interplay of different multiple factors is really very complex. As psychoanalysts, we might be faced with the difficult task of being trying to reconciling opposite and conflicting interests, which requires a very delicate balance. We are not in condition always to offer clear-cut solutions, and often we have to consider each situation in a case-by-case basis. I'm confident that this space of dialogue, open dialogue among peers, will contribute to enhancing this ongoing search for answers to these dilemmas. Well, we are now moving on to open the webinar. Let me please first explain you very briefly about how we are going to work and the running order. The webinar has 2 sections. In the first section, we'll hear the 4 panelists, their brief presentation. They may want, after finishing, to exchange some ideas or comments among them. The second part is a Q&A, questions and answers slot with all of you, the attendees. You have the possibility to submit your questions. Look at the right side of the screen. You'll find a box entitled question. You have to type there your question and click send to submit it. Remember that although you might send your question from the very beginning of the webinar, they won't be answered till the panelists have finished their presentations. Also, you can download the handouts out of the panelists, you have a pane also at the control panel where you click on the name of the handout you want to download on your computer. A last comment. Remember that this is an open dialogue, that all of us, the panelists, attendees, I myself as moderator, we are all responsible for our own opinions. So we'll begin first hearing Dr. Andrew Brooke. But before we hand over to him, I'll read a brief resume of her professional activities. Andrew is the treasurer of the IPA and former chair of the IPA Confidentiality Committee. He has been president of both the Canadian Psychoanalytic Society and the Canadian Philosophical Association. As well as being a licensed psychoanalyst in Canada and a member of the IPA, he is Chancellor's Professor of Philosophy and Cognitive Science Emeritus at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He has about 130 publications in psychoanalytical theory and history, philosophy of mind and cognitive science, Freud, Kant, and environmental ethics. Well, Andrews, are you ready? Can we begin?
Shall we begin?
Yes, please.
Well, good morning, everyone. The technology is behaving perfectly this morning, but we'll do the best we can. All of the panelists had written versions of our presentations, and I believe they're available for you to follow if you wish, though I'm not quite sure how one. So I follow my text fairly close, but I'll try not to read it. So I expect that nearly all have seen the report on confidentiality. It's a big report, covers a lot of important topics. In this morning, the members of each committee, one from each region, will present on some of the more important themes of this report. First, Mayor Bonifacino, Latin American member, will introduce the central tension between the need to preserve confidentiality on the one hand and the need to use clinical material in teaching and scientific presentations on the other. He will also look at the particular context of child and adolescent analysis. John Churchill, the European member and the new chair of the committee, will look at confidentiality in the important context of analysis and supervision using remote technology. And then finally, Alana Furlong, the North American member, will have a further look at the central tension, and she will also look in some detail at the vexed issue of informed consent and at the problem of demands from third parties that confidentiality be reached. And I'll say another. I want to say that this committee has been one of the finest collaborative efforts that I've ever been involved with, within analysis or outside. Just a word of history. The committee began its work in May 2017, so 2 years ago. Its report was accepted by the board just over 18 months ago, last January, at which point the committee moved to the work of implementing the report, work of which this webinar is a part, and I might say that's the point at which the chair turned over. The IPA has had a major interest in confidentiality since the beginning, obviously, but one immediate impetus for the report was a lawsuit a few years ago. It arose due to not just confidential but identifying information being revealed in a clinical presentation at an IPA Congress. The remarks were recorded, the patient learned of the remarks and sued. The IPA ended up paying a substantial settlement. The issue, of course, was not primarily the money, but how to prevent such ethical violations in the future. Confidentiality is part of psychoanalytic treatment, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that. The committee was guided by a number of principles. The first was that there's a deep tension between, as I said, protecting confidentiality on the one hand, and the use we have to make of clinical material in our work on the other. This tension, in view of the committee, sometimes cannot be resolved. The second principle is that patients trust analysts to protect the confidentiality of their communications. The third, the analyst's responsibility for setting the frame creates an asymmetry of power and influence that make it nearly impossible to know, for example, whether consent to use clinical material is freely given. The fourth principle is that both psychoanalytic and non-psychoanalytic issues arise in connection with confidentiality. The fifth principle is that confidentiality is both an ethical and a technical foundation of psychoanalysis. The sixth principle, the analytic community has both institutional and individual responsibilities for protecting confidentiality. The seventh principle, what is required ethically need not always be the same as what the law requires. And this is particularly true in countries governed by relatively non-democratic regimes. And the final principle is that psychoanalysis is part of the wider community and culture. When thinking about confidentiality, we need to keep these wider contexts in mind. With these principles as background, the committee focused on primarily six issues. The first is the issue of protecting patient confidentiality in presentations, and I've already mentioned that issue. The second was protecting confidentiality in publications. As a community, we have perhaps done better in this area than we have with some of the others. The third issue we examined is protecting confidentiality in analysis and supervision using remote technology, and I've already mentioned this issue too. A fourth issue was, what should the profession's stance be when the laws of one's country or the policies of a professional body require or demand or request that confidentiality be breached? Examples of this are reporting requirements and requirements that analysts testify or produce notes in courts of law. We consider two further issues which we will not discuss today. One, which I go into in my notes, and I'll just summarize quickly here, is that in a number of countries, including quite possibly the whole of the European community, patients now own their medical records. And this gives rise to questions about the status of process notes, whether one can use clinical material in scientific presentations, teaching, clinical case studies, even supervision without the patient's consent, and so on. This issue is under very active study, as you might imagine, in Europe. We also looked at an issue concerning confidentiality in the context of our principles of ethics. How should the confidentiality of a colleague accused of wrongdoing be treated during the investigation process? This is before there's been any finding of either wrongdoing or any exoneration. We can on this issue that the protections already in place in our principles of ethics are satisfactory, and that's part of the reason why we won't discuss it further today. So these six issues largely defined the work of the Confidentiality Committee. Nahir Bonifacino will open our discussion. Thank you.
Clear overview, including a wide list of central issues, which no doubt we'll explore later. Now we welcome Dr. Nair Bonifacino. Before she begins her presentation, I would like to tell you a little about her experience in this field. Nair is a psychologist, member of the Uruguayan Psychoanalytic Association, and a child and adolescent psychoanalyst. She received a scholarship from FIPAL and IPA to participate in the research training program in London 2009 and IPA grants in 2009 and 2011 for the development of interdisciplinary research. She's a guest professor of master's studies in Uruguay and in the University of Valencia, Spain, where she's concluding a PhD in perinatal and infant psychology and psychopathology. She was a delegate for Uruguayan Psychoanalytic Association of the Child and Adolescent FIPAL Committee, and she received the first Rebecca Greenberg Award in Child and Adolescent Psychoanalysis from the Madrid Psychoanalytic Society in 2017. She has been a member of the IPA Confidentiality Committee from its inception in June 2017. Well, Nair, it's your turn now.
Well, thank you, Ines. Well, I'm going to present for discussion two areas which are developed in the committee's report. The first one is confidentiality during training, and the second is about some specific issues related to confidentiality in child and adolescent analysis. About the first one, concerning the training, the committee considers that the importance of confidentiality in psychoanalysis requires that candidates be made aware of this issue as a key point in our practice early in their training. As we know, as analysts, we have the professional necessity of sharing clinical material with peers and supervisors, while at the same time, we have the ethical responsibility to protect patients' confidentiality. This situation, that is a given from the first steps of the training, implies always attention and the necessity to make a decision about the best way for the protection of the patient. Since not all institutes currently include in-depth discussion of confidentiality issues during the training, this committee makes some recommendations in order to promote the protection of the patient as a central aspect each time candidates and members share clinical material. The committee's main recommendations for institutes and societies in this field are: first, include a seminar about confidentiality as part of the training. The aim of this proposal is promoting the presentation of clinical material with a discussion of the advantages and disadvantages of the different ways in which confidentiality might be protected, taking into account the limitations and risks of the different resources that are usually used, such as disguise, informed consent, amalgamating case material, multiple or anonymous authorship, etc. A second recommendation is make the protection of confidentiality an issue of regular concern each time members or candidate presents clinical material in society meetings, seminars, and working groups. Concerning this point, the committee makes some concrete suggestions for the protection of confidentiality in the presentation of clinical material in general that are also addressed to the sharing of clinical material during training. These suggestions will be presented later by Alana. A third recommendation is encourage each society to find a way to make thinking about the challenges of protecting confidentiality into a continuous learning project. This proposal could take the route of introducing periodic workshops for the discussion of confidentiality issues in the presentation of clinical cases. And a fourth recommendation is facilitate in each society the discussion of the local legal and professional regulatory environment for the protection of the patient and the analyst in the use of clinical material. The final aim of these recommendations is to promote in our professional community a culture of confidentiality with the protection of the patient privacy as a main concern at every step in which we share clinical material from the beginning of the training. Well, and the second issue I'm going to present is concerning confidentiality in child and adolescent analysis. In these cases, the committee considers there are special circumstances to be taken into account. As in different aspects of our practice, and according with the variation of psychoanalytic theories, each one with its own technical model, some analysts working with children and adolescents consider relevant for the benefit of the minor patient the development of ways for including the restoration of the parent-child or parent-adolescent relationship when it is possible as one of the treatment goals. This conceptualization that implies exchanges between the analyst and the patient's parents avoids a defensive splitting which excludes parents while protecting the confidentiality of the minor's work on him or herself. Taking these aspects into account, the following question can be proposed. How do we, as child and adolescent analysts, understand confidentiality with our minor patients? That is to say, in which terms and in which clinical situations can we conceive the exchanges between the analyst and the patient's parents taking care of the minor confidentiality? And in which terms and in which circumstances can we conceive a possible exchange between the analyst and the school, or between the analyst and other professionals who give assistance to the child or the adolescent, protecting his or her privacy? One particular issue of concern related to these questions in child and adolescent analysis is when there is a concern of a credible threat of serious injury to self or others, or of imminent suicide. In all these cases, the committee agrees with the proposal of the IPA Ethical Committee in considering that a breach of confidentiality may be required and appropriate steps may have to be taken that may include notification of a third party, for example, parent, guardian, school official, etc. Nevertheless, even in cases in which local laws and/or regulations mandate reporting, for example, sexual abuse, the committee considered, and this is relevant, that the analyst, in determining how to respond, should weigh the impact of reporting, bearing in mind the best interest and protection of the child and adolescent, taking into account the clinical situation and the age and stage of development. The general point for which this committee is arguing is that analysts should retain the right to make their own decisions based on each individual treatment. In relation with this, and other aspects on this field of child and adolescent analysis, we invite IPA groups concerned with this issue, such as the Committee on Child and Adolescent Psychoanalysis, the Committee on Child Abuse, and the Intercommittee Project on Child Abuse for further discussion. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nair, for your very precise report covering these two fundamental issues. Now, we will hear Dr. John Churchill. Firstly, I would like to tell you very briefly about his biography. John Churchill is a member of the British Psychoanalytical Society and lives in Manchester. After graduating in philosophy and psychology from the University of Oxford in 1971, he worked in research the psychology at the universities of Edinburgh, Oxford, and Warwick. From 1979 to 2002, he was a lecturer in psychology at the University of Manchester with teaching and research interest in visual perception, infant development, computer-mediated communication, and psychoanalysis. Qualifying as a psychoanalyst in 1997, he worked in private practice in Manchester until he retired in 2013. From 2008 to 2010, he was book review editor for the International Journal and a member of its editorial board. With Leopoldo Blecher, he edited the first English translation of Jose Blecher's Symbiosis and Ambiguity. He has been a member of the IPA Confidentiality Committee from its inception in June 2017 and was appointed its interim chair in March 2019. Well, please, John.
Thank you, Ines. I shall limit my contribution to summarizing some key points in those parts of our report which relate specifically to telecommunications. In the time available, it will not be possible for me to cover everything of importance. In section 4 of the report, we address the question of confidentiality when using any form of electronic telecommunication for communications with a patient or about a patient. This includes what is known variously as remote analysis, distance analysis, teleanalysis, Skype analysis, and telephone analysis, but also clinical supervision and seminars conducted remotely, and exchange by email of process notes and other clinical material. The technology used may be voice telephony by landline or mobile phone, video telephony or video conferencing, email or text. We point out in the report that all such communications are inherently vulnerable to electronic interception and eavesdropping, because the telecommunications system, which includes the telephone or computer, is never completely under the control of the person using it. From information made public by Edward Snowden in 2013, we know that telecommunications are subject to surveillance on a massive scale, and that the contents of private conversations are routinely stored for potential use in protecting national security, fighting terrorism, and so on. In addition to this routine surveillance by the state, telecommunications are increasingly vulnerable to criminal interception for financial, political, personal motives, including by individuals who are known to the person who is being targeted. Measures can be taken to reduce the risk of interception, but it is unclear whether any of them are completely secure. A particularly intractable problem is what is known as endpoint security. That is, how to ensure that communications are not intercepted either before they are encrypted or after they are decrypted. If a telephone or a computer used by a psychoanalyst or a patient has been compromised, unencrypted data can be copied to a third party without the user's knowledge. Thus, even if encryption across the network is good enough, the security of the communication system as a whole can be vitiated by inadequate endpoint security. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. The telecommunicative setting is not the same as the classical setting of the psychoanalyst's consulting room or office. In the classical setting, provided social and political conditions are favorable, our physical control of the places in which we work, together with our tacit knowledge about their acoustic properties, our everyday experience and common sense, normally enable us to maintain privacy and thus to protect confidentiality. As soon as we start to use telecommunications, we're in a different world, which we neither control nor adequately understand. If we really wanted secure telecommunication, we would have to submit ourselves and our patients to a kind of corporate discipline, which is hardly compatible with a psychoanalytic setting. For example, we would have to use only devices supplied by a trusted organization. We would have to subject ourselves and our patients to extremes of discipline and control in using them, and both we and they would have to learn how to use them properly. We would all need to acquire specialist technical knowledge of computer security and to keep it updated. Yet even with such precautions, we would never know if we had gained a degree of security commensurate with that of the classical setting. The risks of telecommunication have long-term consequences. Once information has been acquired by surveillance or by hacking, we have to assume that it will be stored for as long as is technically and financially possible, and that it will be vulnerable indefinitely to further theft and distribution. There is a real risk that a recording of a psychoanalytic session will one day be posted on the internet. There is also a real possibility in any country which currently affords a degree of legal protection to the privacy of communications, that an authoritarian regime achieving power in the future would inherit stored information and use it for arbitrary and repressive measures. Thus, the risk to confidentiality potentially extends far into the future, over the entire lifetimes of patients and those of their families, friends, and associates. In the report, we accept that psychoanalysts will make different estimates of the magnitude of the risk, but the fact that the risk exists is not in doubt. The IPA therefore faces a dilemma. On the one hand, it is seeking to expand the profession, including into new geographic areas such as China. And in this process, increasing numbers of individual psychoanalysts are finding themselves drawn towards engaging in some form of remote working. On the other hand, IPA members are committed by the IPA Ethics Code, as well as by the technical demands of their work, to protecting patient confidentiality. If material from a psychoanalytic session were to be published on the internet, the confidence of patients in their analyst's capacity to maintain confidentiality could be undermined, and the reputational damage to the IPA and its component institutes could be severe. There are no simple solutions that will suit every psychoanalyst. Some will choose not to engage in remote working or to abandon it if already begun. Others will try to mitigate the risks, but this will mean becoming as fully aware as possible of the nature and extent of the risks. They will need to satisfy themselves that they have educated themselves sufficiently about the nature of technology that they're planning to use. In section 9.2 of the report, we recommend that the published advice to members be amended to read as follows. Analysts must satisfy themselves that they understand the limits of the security provided by the technology they and their patients are using, and the limits of their capacity to protect the patient's confidentiality. They should be aware that in psychoanalytic work undertaken using telecommunications, the patient's confidentiality cannot be guaranteed. In the view of the committee, however, this is ultimately an ethical problem rather than a regulatory one. Because the IPA Ethics Code recognizes confidentiality as one of the foundations of psychoanalytic practice, and because it requires psychoanalysts to protect patients' confidentiality, analysts who use telecommunications need to consider whether they are able to protect confidentiality sufficiently and how the impossibility of guaranteeing confidentiality may affect the analytic contract and the analytic work. In the feedback received by the committee about the draft version of the report, which we discuss in section 10.6 of the final report, there was a very wide range of responses relating to this issue, with considerable polarization of views regarding both the extent of the risks and the implications of these risks for psychoanalytical practice. Unsurprisingly, those in favor of remote analysis tend to be less concerned about the insecurity of telecommunications than those who are opposed to it. Several respondents suggested that in today's world, privacy is no longer possible. The committee does not share the pessimism of the more extreme versions of this view. It recognizes the dangers to privacy and hopes that this report will contribute to protecting the privacy of psychoanalytic consultation in the future.
Thank you, John, very much for your clear description of all the current dilemmas linked to the use of telecommunication resources. You have been very honest in describing our limits and the pros and cons to be balanced. Thank you very much. Well, now it's time to hear our fourth panelist, Dr. Alana Furlong. I would like to read a brief resume of her CV. Alana Furlong is a PhD psychologist in full-time private practice and a member as well as a former president of the Société Psychanalytique de Montréal. She's a former member of the North American editorial board of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. She has written about different aspects of the frame, such as missions, symbolic payments in a state cover, healthcare, informed consent, confidentiality, and the issue of patient consent for the use of clinical material in publication and clinical presentation. She has co-edited 2 interdisciplinary collections on confidentiality. She has also published on trauma and temporality in love sickness and dehumanization as a shield against our helpless openness to the other. The later essay was awarded the 2013 JAPA Prize for an original or significant contribution to psychoanalytic literature. Her most recent area of study is free will and unconscious choice. Well, Alana, it's your turn.
Thank you, Edith, and good day to everybody. I'm going to address 3 sections of the report. The first section is the issue of informed consent, which is 3.1 of the report. Informed consent is not a simple matter. Researchers have discovered that accuracy of information is not enough to protect patients from forming what the researchers call therapeutic misconceptions. In psychoanalysis, the issue of informed consent is obviously even more complicated. It is our position that there is an inherent ethical uncertainty about informed consent in psychoanalysis, given the always only partial knowability of transference and countertransference. We know, for instance, that patients can give consent to share clinical material and still feel that the analyst has breached their trust, with potentially serious consequences for their treatment. But there is another level of complexity in our work, beyond the unconscious intersubjective dynamics, or I should say interpsychic dynamics that are part of all analytic treatments. Within the IPA, there is not one model of excellence, but many. There now exist a variety of theoretical schools, each with its own understanding of the mind, each with its own techniques and associated ethics. For example, a fair contingent of IPA members believe that requesting consent is the only ethical action. They also argue that there are therapeutic benefits to informed consent, such as increased trust in the analyst, respect for his or her scientific integrity, and enhanced scientific accuracy from adding the patient's point of view. However, the committee realized that caution is necessary even for advocates of this perspective, because independent research has shown that analysts do not always detect or correctly predict a patient's reactions when consent is sought. The committee felt that the existing documentation does not support the conclusion that any one theoretical school is infallibly better than another in dealing with confidentiality issues. The committee has concluded that there is no universal fail-safe procedure which can be recommended as the best way to protect the analysand when sharing clinical information. In the committee's opinion, apart from the option of not sharing clinical material at all, every alternative at the analyst's disposal has its limitations and its risks. Because of these limitations in our capacity to be confident about our particular ethical choice, and as a complement to our ethical responsibility as individual practitioners, the committee is advocating an added level of protection in the form of what is known as a community of concern approach. Now, Nair mentioned this earlier, and so did Andrew. In the community, whoops, there go my papers. In the community of concern approach, safeguards are introduced at several points in the development and presentation of clinical material, and responsibility for their effectiveness is held by all involved. The aim is to foster a culture of confidentiality in which protection of the patient's privacy and dignity becomes a paramount concern at every point in the development, sharing, and presentation of clinical material. Now, my second section is related to section 3.2 of the report. How to reduce harm to patients engendered by the profession's scientific, technical, and ethical needs to share clinical experience, given what I've said in my first part. In the report, the committee has made a number of concrete suggestions for the presentation of clinical material in congresses and other scientific events. Most of them are straightforward. And given our limited time today, I will mention only 3 suggestions made in the report that are less obvious or might be subject to some debate. The first practical suggestion encourages authors presenting clinical material in scientific presentations or publishing clinical material to make a statement in which they explain how they have addressed the issue of confidentiality and why. The advantages could be twofold. On the one hand, such statements might motivate their authors to make a more thorough assessment of the balance between confidentiality and scientific sharing. And on the other hand, they might provide patients who find out that their confidentiality has been breached with an explanation of the reason and of a possible occasion for further analytic work. However, there are readers of the report who worry that by explaining their methodology and rationale, authors might be inadvertently providing clues as to the identity of their patients. So it'll be interesting to know what our audience thinks of this today. A second suggestion derives from the fact that internet search by author's name is the easiest and most common access patients and others have to publications that may contain private information. Thus, one way to protect confidentiality is to publish or present anonymously or with a pseudonym. Or as Nair said, there's also publishing under several names, might be another possibility. A third suggestion derives from the proposal of a community of concern approach, which I introduced earlier. We recommend that authors systematically undertake consultation with one or more colleagues before including any clinical material in a presentation or publication. Now, we all know that colleagues often do consult, or authors do consult their colleagues before publishing, but we're mentioning this specifically for them to consult their colleagues with respect to how they think the clinical material might come across to the patient if the patient read it. The third part of my presentation has to do with section 5 of our report. What frame of mind should we cultivate with respect to third-party requests for information gathered in the course of psychoanalytic treatment? Requests from outside the profession for information, which has emerged in psychoanalytic treatment, comes in a variety of forms. It comes from insurance companies, from government agencies, from parents, from the courts, or as requirements to report to authorities suspicions about harm or risk of harm to self or third parties. Such requests will often be experienced as demands having the force of the law. For example, when they come from a solicitor, a police officer, a court official, or a government agency. The committee's recommendation is that implicit authority of this kind should always be questioned and guidance sought before making a response. The professional integrity and autonomy of psychoanalytic work is essential to its technical and clinical quality. And bear in mind, in weighing it against other interests, that there is also a public good in the contribution that psychoanalysis makes to society through its work of culture, as Freud put it. You know, this is a point I think many members forget. Yet when a situation arises in which third-party needs have to be weighed against what is good for treatment, the task of containing and interpreting primitive anxieties can become particularly challenging for the analyst. The committee makes the case for what is called discretionary privilege, meaning that the who, how, and why of any demand for a breach in confidentiality is considered first and foremost a matter for clinical decision and ethical judgment by the individual analyst. A decision that can be based on what best protects the integrity of treatment and the patient. Now, Nair mentioned this earlier too, with respect to minors. The IPA Ethics Committee has recently taken the same position. Let me explain that the committee is arguing that the appropriate ethical situation or position in these situations is that analysts should assume a default position of confidentiality. And if they must weigh confidentiality against other interests, and this refers back again to the community of concern approach, analysts should be encouraged to consult with their peers in arriving at a decision. The committee contends that it is not and should not be IPA policy that members should automatically accept third-party demands that can have considerable consequences for the course of treatment. The committee's final point in this section has to do with the institutional level. The committee believes that IPA should, when requested, give support to institutions whose members are objecting on ethical grounds to attempts by external agencies to override the protection of confidentiality. This does not mean that we condone a disregard for the law or for public safety, nor does it mean that we fail to recognize the important function of courts in enforcing the law, nor is it a criticism of the work that insurance companies do. Rather, we believe that discretionary privilege and the psychoanalytic community's support for such a privilege, now I'm stressing both the individual and the community level, is a necessary backing for psychoanalysts who have to make difficult clinical decisions. That's all I have to say for the moment.
Thank you very much, Alana, for your profound and thorough analysis of these difficult problems of our clinical practice. Now, before passing to the second section of the webinar, I ask you, maybe you want to make a comment or question to share with your fellow panelists, do you? Or we move on?
I think we've spent 2 years talking to each other. Now we want to hear from outside the committee.
So it's time to go on. We received many interesting questions. We won't have time to cover all of them. I begin by this one. Question for John Churchill. Independently from the material security, and suppose this is resolved, what does he think that intimacy and confidentiality cover the same space of transference experience? And counter-transference? Which are the intersections and differences? Thank you very much for your clear presentation.
Ines, could you please repeat the question, because I didn't hear all of it fully.
Yes, I did. Independently from the material security, and suppose this is resolved, what do you think? What does he think that intimacy and confidentiality cover the same space of transference experience?
What do I think? Intimacy
and counter-transference?
And counter-transference. Yes, I can see what
the intersections and differences between intimacy and confidentiality.
Right. Yes. What is clear to me about the question is that it's addressing an extremely interesting area, and I still don't fully understand the question, but I certainly think that the intimacy of the psychoanalytic encounter, which of course has many aspects which are not represented and non-figurable in the sense of Botella, is possibly a much wider topic than is covered by the problem of confidentiality of what is captured by telecommunications. That said, we all know that it's possible, and indeed very common, to have intimate conversations by telephone. And indeed, it may be that one of the factors which maintains the illusion of privacy in telecommunications is this fact that we enter quite easily into intimate communication with, particularly with people who we are close to, over the telephone or over other means, so that very quickly the illusion of being private reestablishes itself. Before this seminar began, while we were just meeting the organizers and the presenters, I think you said, Ines, or maybe it was Sylvia, said, yes, there are 473 people out there, but very soon you'll have the impression, don't worry, because very soon you'll have the impression there are only 4 or 5 of us. And I said, yes, that's precisely the problem. So I'm not sure if I've answered the question because I didn't understand fully the question, but the topic of the relationship between intimacy, confidentiality, and telecommunications is clearly very interesting.
Thank you, John. I don't know if the other panelists want to add some comment. No?
Andrew.
Andrew?
Let me say that the remit of this committee was confidentiality, and the same issues arise over protecting confidentiality in all areas identified. And I think the point John made is very important, that we can be easily lulled into a sense that confidentiality is all right, is being well protected, when in fact it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just say one more thing, Ines? I now have
Yes.
the text of the question in front of me, and I
Yes.
understand it better. It's actually a very demanding question, which I would be interested to try to reply to after this webinar if I can, because it raises many, many important issues, the relationship between the transference and countertransference aspects of the encounter. But I don't feel I can say much about it now.
And in fact, John has published an article, at least one article, I think, that tries to look at some of these issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, so we pass to another question. Second, please. Your concerns to the committee members, to all the panelists. Your concerns have engaged the imagination of several colleagues and myself. The takeaway for us of Dr. Churchill's comments are: if you are important enough to be under government surveillance, it is best to do an in-room analysis in a location swept for bugging devices. Oh, sorry. In an in-room analysis in a location swept for bugging devices and impenetrable how to stop. This is, sorry, I can't. Sorry, I have to pass to another question. I complete this afterwards. Don't you need the body present for analyzing transference and counter-transference in modern psychoanalysis?
I would like to say something about the scope of the problem there.
Mm-hmm.
The remit of our committee is to study confidentiality. There are much wider issues raised by the whole question of remote analysis, much wider than this committee can address. And the presence or absence of the body is a very good example, in my personal view. And as Alana says, I have published on that. But it's beyond the remit of our work to go into that, even though that's some of the most interesting aspects of the problem and of the debate and the controversy about remote analysis. And its relationship to the transference and the countertransference. Arguably, it's one of the few topics which doesn't have an implication for confidentiality, unless you want to consider specifically the confidentiality of visual images of a patient and of an analyst. But I mean, so I think really we need to be clear that the function of this committee is to consider confidentiality. If it is becoming the case that there are many questions being addressed of a wider nature about telecommunications, that indicates that there is a need for some body, some entity within the IPA to address this question, in my view. But it's not us.
Do you want to add any other? No? Well,
I think Inez.
So, this another yes.
Sorry, Inez. I just think the committee doesn't want to discourage people from thinking of these aspects.
No.
We're thinking of them ourselves. It's just that it is beyond the scope of our mandate to look into this aspect. And other analysts on the international front are looking at this. And I know we all know it's a very interesting, challenging, a new situation for us as analysts.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are moving to another question addressed to Dr. Nair. With reference to cases of sexual abuse of a minor, specifically in all those cases where there is an ongoing risk of exposure to new traumatic experiences for the same or other potential victims. The question is, should we consider any exceptions to the rule of the obligatory reporting of a case to a responsible adult in the service of protection of confidentiality in the treatment?
Well, I think in this case, in these cases will be very important, first of all, the exchanges of the committee with the groups that are working this issue, IPA groups that are working this issue. I think we as a committee emphasize the need that each analyst weigh the necessity or to inform and the situation of each patient, particularly. So I think that this is our point as a committee. The need to and there are some situations that show that the importance that the analyst should wait and think about the ways to inform or not about the situations. That is, it's the analyst work in each clinical situation, what we are promoting that way. This is bad. Maybe. Yes.
Could I add just a comment? Didn't emphasize this in the report, but
of course,
we didn't emphasize this in the report. But if one of us decides that a request being made of us is not ethically acceptable, a request from an authority, there can be consequences. It's not a risk-free road to take, and sometimes it will require some considerable courage on the part of the analyst.
Inez, could I also add a
yes,
comment?
of course. Yes.
I think from my experience, analysts sometimes make the mistake of being too confidential amongst themselves, which is paradoxical, that they don't, they are ashamed of situations, overwhelmed by situations in which they might find themselves with a number of anxieties about responsibilities to people outside of the therapeutic relationship, and they try to deal with it all by themselves instead of consulting with their colleagues. And then I think they mix up the confidentiality of the individual session with the need for the community to think together, that there really has confidentiality is also a container in the wider sense. And often we make impulsive decisions which we don't need to make, even legally, because we don't know exactly the legal situation, and we haven't allowed ourselves the time to think. So allowing ourselves to think and reflect before giving in to or deciding on a particular request for information is essential. And we don't take advantage of it enough, in my opinion.
Do you want to add some comment about this idea that Alana is highlighting?
No, just to reaffirm, is what Alana said. This is essential for the protection of the patient. So we have to keep in mind and think with colleagues the way to do the next steps that maybe we should do. No?
Okay. Another question: how does psychoanalysis adapt to cultural issues around confidentiality? For example, over-involvement of parents and relatives. This is for the four of you. Who wants to begin, or should I repeat it?
No, I think it's a very interesting challenge, how to deal with differences culturally, ethnically, in terms of family involvement. I don't know. I don't think we've specifically addressed this issue in the report. We haven't looked into the research on this, but it seems to me we could probably agree that a great deal of tact is necessary on the part of the analyst to, and I think our colleagues, the two Noviks, our American colleagues, the two Noviks, have done a lot of interesting work here in terms of trying to work out a way of involving parents and relatives while not betraying the confidentiality of the minor or the adolescent from the viewpoint of his own intimacy. But his relationships with his family are very important. And I think the same is true of different ethnic groups where family is terribly important.
Mm-hmm.
But we still have to encourage, I think, the development of an individual psyche capable of making its own decisions with respect to these relatives and weighing their own sense of responsibility to their families.
Can I come into that?
Yes,
a couple of points. One is that in our report, we talk about the protection of privacy, both from a psychoanalytic. We say we point out that the IPA has two distinct ways in which it ethically protects privacy, and the second of these is a general one. It's through the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, because we say as part of our ethical code that as a psychoanalyst should not do anything which is against the content of the Declaration of Human Rights, and that includes, as one of its articles, privacy. Now that, of course, comes entirely from outside psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis has made part of its relationship with the wider world in those terms. And I think the question, although the example that's given in the question is the involvement of patients and relatives, and we can think easily of what that might mean in terms of, for example, one family member asserting a right to know what's going on with another family member, independently of their wishes. I think it actually also addresses the question of cultural change that is consequent upon technological change, because as we increasingly use telecommunications, that is producing in all of our cultures cultural change. So when some people argue that privacy is dead, they're making a statement about, they're making a claim about a change in culture of a global kind, actually. So I think it's a very interesting question because it puts together things that we're familiar with, which differentiate different national communities, and global processes which are affecting us all. And of course, psychoanalysis is obliged to adjust and adapt to some extent, but then there are some circumstances in which psychoanalysis ceases to be possible. I think that is something that has to be borne in mind.
And perhaps could we, this is an epistemological and philosophical and ethical question. Maybe all international members would not agree, but certainly from my point of view, psychoanalysis is an institution which thoroughly believes in the universality of the need for a private space to think.
Yes.
In order to relate in a more authentic way to the environment, whether it be to one's family, one's spouse, one's community. And I would argue that that's universal, regardless of the fact that certain ethnic groups or certain cultures are perhaps more community-minded, more collectively minded. I would still argue that there is this need for the individual to have a single and private space, and without that, we run into very serious collective problems in terms of groupthink and the inability to rebel against certain things that we feel individually are not right. So this capacity to think individually, I think, is a very important ethical issue that we as psychoanalysts should be defending across the world.
I agree.
Okay. Well, I
Andrew,
pass to another question. Do you think
Sorry.
that every society should have a committee to address confidentiality issue often linked to ethical issues?
But I think we more or less say just that in the report, don't we?
Yes, I think that's in Nair's ballpark.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, we said this, that it's important to have the issue on the table, at least, no? So yes, it could be interesting, a group of people that lead these issues about confidentiality and manage the way to work about it in each society. I think is part of our report, no? A group that could do the proposals of keep the issue of confidentiality as a key aspect, no, in the society, because it's an everyday issue, no, in our exchanges.
Mm-hmm. It's true that you stated very clearly in your report, but the existence of the question is an evidence that the necessary permanent review of these topics.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I would add that the crucial difference will be between creating an institution which, in a purely formal way, and ultimately a dead way, a lifeless way, addresses the topic, and creating an institution which, in a live way, is actually continually looking at it. I think it's very easy to set up a structure which, in name and in form, appears to be dealing with a problem, and then it just serves as a means to push it somewhere else, to a means for forgetting, really. Now, how to do that is not clear to me. Or the committee has thought about that, but we haven't got any clear overall recommendations.
Yes, I think the point is to be active, each society to be active in this issue.
And each individual, I mean that, because it raises the issue that there's a general tendency for individual practitioners to want there to be some committee, some panel that they can say, some set of rules which they can go to and get a simple yes/no answer to a problem. And what we're saying is that is not the way in which confidentiality can be, in which a culture of confidentiality can be maintained. It can only be if each individual psychoanalyst is constantly increasing their education, their awareness, their concern about this individually and in consultation with others. How to do that?
Yeah, just to add that in each society, confidentiality is related to learning groups with teaching with the way that the clinical presentations are done in seminars. It's related with scientific activities inside the society or outside. So it's a very a present issue, or should be a present issue in each situation, each of these situations.
And could I add, because I think there is a tendency, at least in the North America that I'm reasonably familiar with, to look to our regulatory bodies from our home disciplines for advice on these matters. And we don't make the effort to really think things through from a psychoanalytic point of view. We need to differentiate, to internally and collectively, while looking at what other bodies, professional bodies have developed, we still need to think through whether or not that's entirely appropriate for us, or whether it needs to be interpreted in an individual way for psychoanalysis, specific to the kind of work we do. And that's one of the, I think that's where we're looking forward as a committee to working with individual societies to develop ways locally with how to make these questions alive for candidates and for members.
Well, as we are short of time, and as I see in the list, see how some questions appears once and twice repeatedly, I choose two of them who are connected because both refers to current limitations in our safeguarding efforts to protect confidentiality. One refers to remote analysis, and the other is about e-journals. The first one, when the report tells us that remote analysis is never under control of the user, and that privacy is fundamental for psychoanalysis, how can remote analysis be tolerated under ethical aspects?
You want me to address that one now, or do you have a second question that's linked?
The second question, I have the second question. As regards the central tension between the online scientific publication of clinical material and the protection of patients' privacy, the report seems to conclude that there are no completely safe alternatives to develop a scientific clinical dialogue using e-resources. In view of this state of affairs, which specific editorial policies would you recommend as a guide for our e-journals? This is the other question.
Yes, and they are linked, these questions, I agree, because
yes,
in a way, the question is, do you require absolute assurance of privacy? Now, in the report, we point out that in the classical setting, there are, even in the classical setting, and even before the invention of smartphones, there could be circumstances in which the privacy of the psychoanalytic consultation was compromised. But, and this would include, for example, if you were trying to conduct psychoanalysis under social and political conditions where ordinary privacy inside a domestic building or an office is not taken for granted. And we make the point that there are circumstances under which psychoanalysis, and in the sense of an activity conducted in the classical setting, is not possible. Okay. And I'm aware that, obviously, when I say that there are members of the IPA and there are psychoanalytic practitioners who have had to work under extremely difficult conditions, politically and socially, in order to be able to develop psychoanalysis against the tide of the prevailing thinking. Nevertheless, I think that in our training and our experience of working as analysts, we have a sense of what constitutes privacy in the classical setting. And the contrast between that and the telecommunicative setting is a qualitative one. So coming to the question, how can remote analysis be tolerated under ethical aspects? I mean, I translate the question as, how can remote analysis ever be ethically warranted? I personally think that's a very serious question that can't be evaded. But I am aware that there are colleagues who take a different view. There are colleagues who believe that the risks are manageable, that it's a matter of degree, and that there are also countervailing factors which may outweigh the issue of security. So, for example, if a patient is hospitalized and the only way of speaking to the patient to continue the analysis is by telephone, and there's an analysis already underway, then you can see very clearly how an argument would be constructed. Or if training has to be conducted, in order for training to be possible in a very remote, in a place where it's difficult to maintain confidentiality, then either there's no training or there's the use of telecommunications. But it comes back to the point that I think that each and every psychoanalyst has to get themselves better educated, better informed about the nature of the technology that they're using. We can't, what we can't do is just pretend that using telecommunications is speaking down a private tube between one person and another.
Well, we come to an end. Sorry about all the other questions that we can't cover. Thank you very much to the panelists and to all the members of the Confidentiality Committee for this fundamental contribution. Thank you very much also to the attendees, which contributions have
could I say one sentence? This is not the end of the work of the Confidentiality Committee. It's more like the beginning. The committee is continuing and would continue to welcome further submissions, questions, comments, whatever.
Absolutely.
Thank you for this. Adding this fundamental, that to leave open in a space of dialogue. Well, I hope all the attendees will join us in our next webinar that's going to be on August the 25th. The topic that a moment will be on is about working parties contributing to the scientific development of psychoanalysis, the working parties. And the presenters will be Dr. Ruggiero Levi from Brazil, Dr. Bernard Reith from Switzerland, Dr. Marie Ruden from the United States, and Dr. Agustina Fernandez from Argentina. Remember, will join us, please. Well, thank you very much again.
Good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good day.
Thank you.